America is a great country to live in if you love caves, particularly on the Ozark Plateau here in Missouri, in the western chains of the Appalachian Mountains, and in the Edwards Plateau in Texas, among other places. America has caves just hither and yon, and they're so interesting because not only are they geologic features that are carved out through entire epochs of time, not only are they kind of cryptic, and not only are they a mainstay in our culture, in our arts. You think all the way back to Socrates' allegory of the cave in ancient Greece as a metaphor for enlightenment, all the way up until Western movies today, modern Westerns, where the bad guys use a cave as a hideout. They kind of haunt not only the American imagination, but the human imagination, caves do. But not only all of that, they're home to these amazing and unique creatures that are specifically adapted to life somewhere cool and damp and dark. So for instance, bats. Various salamanders.
Here's a cave salamander, number 4. And we've seen 2 slimies now, but both of them have been too far tucked back in there for pictures.
There are also cave fish, cave crayfish, and so forth. So as part of the Environmental Economics series, and welcome back, by the way, to the Environmental Economics series, I hope we can do a little bit about caves in various places, in the Ozarks here, possibly in the Appalachians, and maybe that journey will lead us to talking to some experts and seeing some cool and rare cave salamanders. Maybe it won't, maybe it'll just stay general. But in any case, hoping to do at least a couple episodes about caves, and right now we start with it simple. This is just a little neighborhood cave in the town of Sarcoxie, Missouri, which is about halfway between Springfield and Joplin. We're very near the borders of Oklahoma and Kansas, less than an hour away from both of them. And this is, I believe, a limestone cave. Here, if you came back at night, I bet you'd see dark-sided salamanders, cave salamanders, western slimies, pickerel frogs, kind of your stereotypical Ozark cave amphibians. And another thing that's interesting with caves and why environmental economics comes into play is that, particularly if you have a wet weather cave, you could probably hear the gurgling of the stream behind me, and it's kind of at my feet, it's coming out of the entrance of this cave, is for a wet weather cave, where does the water come from that flows through the cave? Well, it comes from somewhere on the surface, right? Or it comes from an aquifer that's recharged by water that comes to the surface. And so how do you deal with the problem of, even if you conserve the cave or preserve the cave or make it a park or whatever, making sure that the water flowing into the cave is not polluted with things? That's kind of an interesting problem to think through. Laws on water rights are very different across the U.S. In the western states, they tend to have stricter laws on water rights where people upstream do not have the right to either dump in whatever they want or take water out of the stream because it's a very scarce resource out there. And in the eastern and central states, the water laws are much less stringent on uses of water in general. So that's one problem to think through. And then another interesting one that we see is the spread of white nose syndrome in bats, which is very unfortunate. This cave, I would bet, does not have bats, right? It's a small cave and there's water coming out the entrance almost as high as the entrance itself. So I'd be pretty shocked if there were bats. But there's been a lot of die-offs in American caves over the past, roughly decade, 2 decades, due to white nose syndrome. And due to that, a lot of public caves now will have gates that prevent unauthorized entry, because if you have something on your boots, if you have something on your shoes, your clothes, whatever that you're taking in from another cave, and that white nose syndrome can get in the bat population while they're sleeping. It's a fungus that kind of grows on them, and it'll kill them as they're in their hibernation in the winter. So that's kind of one conservation issue with caves, and part of the reason you see a gate. Now, thinking back a few videos, and I'll give you a second to figure this out, what would we call, in economic terms, a gate at the front of the cave? How could we think about that in kind of supply-demand terms, where the good in question that there's supply and demand of is cave recreation? So I'll give you a second to think about that. So what we call that is a quota set to 0. So you remember, if the supply curve is made vertical at a given point, that's a quota, right? And if it's any number besides 0, what you're saying is the damage past this amount of people using this resource, or this amount of resource being emitted, like sulfur dioxide emissions with acid rain, is so severe that I don't want to issue, a tax that'll just move the equilibrium. I don't want to, impose a fee that will move the marginal demand around, or the quantity demanded. What I want to do is say you cannot use more than this quantity. Okay, and then the market price will adjust. But a ban is the same as saying a quota set to 0. So it doesn't matter what anyone's willing to pay. The answer is you can't use the resource. It's a quota set to 0. So what you're saying when you set a quota to 0 is that the value of the resource in question that you're trying to preserve is basically infinite. Like it wouldn't matter if someone was willing to pay $1 million to go into the cave and explore it. The chance that they'd be carrying a white nose syndrome, we're going to keep that quota set to 0. There is no demand curve that will make an equilibrium quantity anything other than 0. So it's the economics behind it. Many caves are not like that. This one doesn't have a gate, for instance. Again, I suspect it doesn't have bats. I suppose it's pretty hard to explore. But so interesting to think about. What does completely closing off a cave mean? And then, is that ever unjustified? Is it sometimes justified? I'd lean towards sometimes justified. For instance, if you're preserving like one of the last populations of Georgia blind salamanders or something, unless there's a research purpose or an educational purpose, or someone knows the researcher or something, and they're going to follow the proper protocols, it's really not worth opening it up. Okay, now to take that topic and switch to another interesting cave topic is a lot of caves now are developed. Right? They're show caves, particularly the big ones, and particularly here in the Ozarks, although there are a few in the Appalachians too. Like up on Lookout Mountain, there's a show cave. I know there are a few in Virginia, Luray Caverns and Dixie Caverns. And that is that there are some caves that are privately owned and pretty well conserved because people don't mess with them, or the landowner wants to conserve their cave. There are publicly owned caves, and then there are show caves where on purpose people are coming through, paying money, and they're seeing the geological formations, they're seeing the animals. In the summer they're getting a break from the heat, in the winter they're getting a break from the cold because the cave's, constant 60 or 70 or whatever it is. And then the landowner's making money. Yet at the same time, if people are constantly going through there and there's constantly light, then that might affect a species that is very sensitive, has what you call a negative phototaxis, where it naturally moves away from light, like say a grotto salamander or an Ozark cavefish, or even a dark-sided salamander, although those aren't particularly rare. So that's one issue to think of, is just the ownership of the cave and what the motive driving the management of the cave is. Is it profit? Is it conservation? Is it some mix of both? Is it just family ties to the land? Or, and what is the best way to manage a given cave? And then another thing is that in some parts of the country that have caves and aquifers and springs and so forth, there's really rapid development going on right now. So Florida, Texas, Tennessee are states that are growing incredibly quickly. And those are also states that have caves and very sensitive cave critters. And then saltwater intrusion. This only really comes into play in, say, the Floridian aquifer, in some of the caves in North Florida and South Georgia. But if sea levels go up, then beneath the surface, the freshwater aquifer that feeds that cavern is only, say 20, 30 feet above the Gulf of Mexico, so there's some mesh point where the saltwater and the freshwater meet, and if the sea level goes up a little bit, then the mesh point inland goes up a little bit underground, and you can get saltwater intrusion into the aquifer, which is also not good if you're relying on the aquifer for your drinking water, but it's also not good if you're a cave critter that needs fresh water. So yeah, just some things to think about. Kicking off a cave series. If you haven't yet, go check out our West Coast trip video on Bethany's channel. Check out the stuff we've been doing on the glades here in Missouri and the Flint Hills of Kansas on my channel. And I hope you all are enjoying the series. Sorry we took a break from it for a little bit. Life got a little hectic, and we had some trips where we couldn't really work this in very much. But back to the economic series, and hopefully this goes somewhere. But yeah, hope you're doing well. Happy herping wherever you are. Hope you enjoyed the series, and have a great rest of your spring. So I was just filming that episode that you guys saw. It turned out to be only the first part of it, because I have just bumped into this gentleman by the name of Nick. And Nick, what organization are you with?
I'm with Ozarks Land Trust, and so we are a nonprofit conservation organization that essentially we raise money from private donors, government entities, etc., all with the goal of protecting private lands for conservation purposes. So this cave that we're at right now, the Sarcoxy Cave in Spring, has endangered species in the cave, Ozark cavefish, grotto salamander, threatened Arkansas darters, and so there was a lot of interest by various conservation governmental organizations to protect the property, but we're right in the middle, a block away from the town square in downtown Sarcoxy, so the Department of Conservation wasn't necessarily interested in it, so we stepped in the late 90s, pooled all of our resources together and the resources from our various partners, and purchased the property so that we could protect the cave and the spring branch and allow all the creatures that live here to make it home like they have for the last thousands of years.
Yeah, and I find this awesome because it was a couple videos back I was talking about how if there's a private interest that already owns a place or wants to develop it, but there are many people whose preference is actually greater, mathematically speaking, to preserve it, unless they can pool their resources, that's hard to win that battle. So I find that interesting economically. Practically, if people wanted to donate to your organization, is there a website where they could donate to the cause of cave conservation here in Missouri?
Yeah, that's right. So besides this one, we protect a lot of other caves. Folks can go to ozarklandtrust.org, and that'll go towards not only our cave protection, but savannas, forest, and helps protect over 30,000 acres throughout the Ozark region.
Yeah, awesome. Well, serendipitous run-in, and
Yeah.
Nick, thank you for your time.
Yeah,
sir.
thank you.